Ravaged by drought, Lake Mead, the nation's largest reservoir, is currently at less than 30% of its capacity.
It may not be a surprise to you that the elevation at Lake Mead is relatively low.
There's been a lot of talk about Lake Mead leading into the 4th of July.
There is a white line etched into the canyon walls of Lake Mead that most visitors walk right past without a second thought. They assume it's a watermark, a mineral stain, something old and irrelevant. They take a photo, post it, move on. But that line is not a stain. That line is a confession. A 100-year-old confession baked into federal law, poured into concrete, and signed by men who already knew or strongly suspected that the number they were writing down was wrong. And for decades, the lake covered it up. All of it. The mistakes, the math, the missing water, and in at least one documented case, the bodies. Because as Lake Mead has dropped to historic lows, something extraordinary has been happening beneath the surface. Divers and rangers and ordinary visitors have been finding things that were never supposed to resurface. A boat sitting upright in the silt like it had been parked by someone who expected to come back. Rusted machinery from a drowned era. And then, in the summer of 2022, a barrel, a rusted metal barrel, half buried in the newly exposed mud of a lake bed that hadn't seen daylight in 50 years. And inside that barrel, a body, a human skeleton, with a gunshot wound to the skull. Forensic analysis dated it to the late 1970s or early 1980s. For roughly half a century, someone's secret had been sitting on the bottom of the largest reservoir in the United States, patient as stone, waiting for the water to drop far, enough to let it breathe, and the water finally dropped. Now here is the question nobody is asking loudly enough. What else is down there? And what does it tell us about a system? A legal, political, agricultural system that has always solved its most uncomfortable problems by sinking them. Stay with me through this one, because we are going to go deep into the water, into the history, into the mathematics of collapse. And what we find down there will change the way you think about every glass of water you drink if you live anywhere west of the Rockies. The scale of what was lost. Before we get to the barrel, you need to feel the scale of what we are talking about, because the discovery only makes sense against the backdrop of how enormous this lake once was and how much of it is simply gone. Lake Mead sits on the Nevada-Arizona border, held back by Hoover Dam. At peak capacity, it holds approximately 26.12 million acre-feet of water. An acre-foot is enough water to cover an entire acre of land 1 foot deep, roughly 326,000 gallons. Multiply that by 26 million, and you start to get a sense of what full looks like. When the lake is at capacity, it could submerge the entire state of Pennsylvania under a foot of water. Every highway, every city, every mountain, gone beneath a single inland sea manufactured from a desert river. In 1983, Lake Mead hit its highest recorded elevation, 1,225 feet above sea level. Water was actually thundering down the emergency spillways carved into the canyon walls, roaring and foaming, more water than the system knew what to do with. If you stood on that shoreline in 1983, you would have felt like the whole thing was working. Like the men who built it got everything right. That moment of abundance was, in fact, the peak of a lie. Today, the lake hovers at roughly a third of its capacity. 2 out of every 3 parts of the largest reservoir in the United States gone. And the proof of that loss is carved right into the rock in the form of a pale white band of calcium carbonate. Minerals leached from the water and deposited layer by layer on the canyon walls over decades of contact. That band now stretches approximately 175 vertical feet above the current waterline. That is the height of a 17-story building. That is what used to be water and is now just dry air and exposed rock and, in some places, things the mud had been keeping to itself for a very long time. Let that sink in before we go further. A 17-story building's worth of water vanished, not gradually, not over centuries, within the lifetime of people who are alive and reading this right now. The discoveries. When water recedes from a lake bed, It does not just leave dry ground behind. It leaves a record, a museum of everything the water swallowed over the decades. And Lake Mead has been an extraordinarily busy museum since 2020, as the water level has continued its historic decline. An expanding ring of previously submerged lakebed has been steadily appearing. And with it, boats. Not just scattered wreckage, but entire boats, some of them sitting perfectly upright in the silt, engines still attached, steering wheels intact, as though someone anchored them neatly and simply forgot to come back. Sunken since the 1980s and 1990s, they had sat in the dark and the cold at the bottom of the lake, preserved by the very depth and stillness that hid them. Now they were in the sun again. Alongside the boats came old intake structures, construction equipment, remnants of infrastructure from the early dam building era, and the eroded foundations of communities that were deliberately flooded when the reservoir was first filled in the 1930s. An entire drowned geography, returning. But it was 2022 that changed the tone of the story entirely. In May of that year, a visitor spotted something in the newly exposed mud near Boulder Beach on the Nevada side. Rangers were called. What they found was a rusted metal barrel, roughly 55 gallons. It had been sitting on the lakebed long enough that the surrounding silt had partially swallowed it. But the water drop had finally brought it into range. Inside the barrel, human skeletal remains. The Clark County medical examiner was brought in. Forensic analysis confirmed a gunshot wound. The timeline established was the late 1970s to early 1980s, meaning this body had been submerged for somewhere between 40 and 50 years before the receding water revealed it. No identification was immediately made. Las Vegas Metropolitan Police opened a homicide investigation, and then the coverage moved on. The way coverage always does, chasing the next thing. But the story didn't end there, because more barrels were spotted along the lakebed in subsequent months. More remains were reported. Investigators acknowledged they expected additional discoveries as the water continued to drop. Think about what that means. Lake Mead sits at the edge of Las Vegas, a city with a documented history of organized crime activity, mob-controlled casinos, and, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, a very real and very active underworld that had specific methods for making problems disappear. The lake, vast, deep, cold, inaccessible, was always the obvious answer to a certain kind of question. For 50 years, those answers sat undisturbed on the bottom. The lake was deep enough and full enough to keep every secret thrown into it. Now the lake is not that deep anymore, and it is giving everything back. I want you to pause right here and think about this. If you were the kind of person who disposed of a problem in that lake in 1979, you are in your 70s or 80s now. You spent decades certain that the secret was safe at the bottom of the largest reservoir in the country. What do you do on the morning the news reports that barrel number 1 has been found, and that they expect to find more? That question is not rhetorical. Active investigations are ongoing as of this writing. The math behind the mystery. Now here is where we pull back from the surface, from the bodies and the boats, and go deeper than any diver has gone. Because the most shocking thing about Lake Mead is not what is surfacing from the bottom. It is what built the conditions that allowed it to surface. To understand this, we have to go to a room in Santa Fe, New Mexico. In November of 1922, the Colorado River flows through 7 states on its way from the Rocky Mountains down toward the Gulf of California, or at least it used to reach the Gulf. More on that in a moment. By the early 1900s, every one of those 7 states had arrived at the same realization simultaneously. Whoever controlled the Colorado River controlled the American West, and under existing water law, the operative principle was brutal in its simplicity. First in time, first in right. Use the water first, and it is yours forever. Everyone who comes after you gets whatever is left. California, the fastest growing state in the country, was downstream. California had the capital, the population, the political reach to build the canals and pull water out of the Colorado at a scale no upstream state could match, which meant that if nothing was done, California would simply claim the river, legally, permanently, irrevocably, and states like Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah would watch their own water flow past them toward Los Angeles without ever being permitted to touch it. The upstream states were furious. Arizona's governor was sufficiently enraged that he seriously floated the idea of deploying the state militia to the river's edge. Think about that for a moment. A sitting American governor threatening military force over water rights. That is the temperature of the room into which federal mediators stepped in 1922. The 7 states sent representatives to Santa Fe. And on November 24, 1922, they signed what became known as the Colorado River Compact. The river was divided into 2 basins, upper and lower, and each basin was allocated 7.5 million acre-feet of water per year, 15 million total, with a modest additional allocation promised to Mexico. Everyone got a guaranteed share. The militia stood down. On paper, it looked like statesmanship. In practice, it was a calculation built on sand. To divide a river, you first need to know how much river there is. And in 1922, the only flow data available covered approximately 2 decades, from about 1899 to 1921. The negotiators took those 20 years, averaged them out, and arrived at an annual flow figure of roughly 17.5 million acre-feet, a number generous enough to hand out 15 million to the states and still leave a comfortable buffer. A number big enough that everyone at the table could sign their name in good conscience, except those 20 years were a lie. Not a deliberate lie. A meteorological one. We know now, from tree ring science that did not exist in mature form until decades later, that the 1899 to 1921 window captured one of the single wettest periods the Colorado River had experienced in over 1,000 years. Researchers were able to reconstruct the river's flow history going back to approximately 800 AD by analyzing the rings inside ancient trees, fat rings in wet years, thin rings in dry ones, old trees, dead but preserved trees, a continuous record of rainfall written in wood for 1,200 years. When that record was laid out and the Colorado's true long-run average was calculated, the number was not 17.5 million acre-feet per year. It was approximately 13 million. The gap between what the law promised and what the river actually carries, in a typical, non-anomalous year, is more than 4 million acre-feet every year, baked into the legal foundation of the American Southwest before a single shovel of dirt was turned for the dam. The entire water allocation system of 7 states and 40 million people was built on top of a 20-year anomaly that the negotiators mistook for the normal character of a river that had been running for millennia. Now here is the part that transforms this from a historical accident into something harder to forgive. There were people in and around that Santa Fe negotiation who said precisely this: engineers, hydrologists, men who understood rivers. They looked at 2 decades of data and said out loud, 2 decades is not enough. The measurement window is too short. The wet years may not hold. This number is probably too high. They were overruled, not because anyone could prove them wrong. The tree ring science that would confirm their instincts did not yet exist. They were overruled because a smaller, more accurate number would have meant less water to distribute. Less water meant more fighting. More fighting meant the whole negotiation collapsing back into the near war it had been. The federal government wanted peace. The states wanted their allotment. The big, wrong, comfortable number was what kept everyone in the room and got everyone to sign. So they wrote it down, and they went home, and they built a civilization on top of a figure that someone in that very room had already warned them was too large. The bucket and the buffer. If you understand that the law promised more water than the river could deliver, the next question is obvious. How did it work for 70 years? The answer is Lake Mead itself. Hoover Dam, completed in 1936, the largest dam ever built by human hands at that point, created a reservoir so enormous it could function as a buffer between the promise and the reality. The logic was straightforward. In the wet years, when the river ran above its long-term average, you captured the surplus, you filled the bucket, and in the dry years, when the river fell short of its legal obligations. You opened the valves and released what you had saved. The shortfall was invisible. The states downstream got their allocations. The farmers got their water. The cities grew. Nobody had to look too closely at the arithmetic because the reservoir was quietly absorbing the gap between the law and the river, year after year, smoothing the difference so seamlessly that generations of people never had to know it existed. For most of the 20th century, this worked. The bucket filled, held, and released. Through droughts and wet cycles, the water level rose and fell within a manageable band. And then, around the year 2000, the wet years simply stopped arriving with their old reliability. The river began running lighter, not dramatically at first, not in any way that made headlines, but the bucket that had been absorbing a 4 million acre-foot deficit every year had been running on borrowed time, and it was running out of water to borrow against. By 2010, Lake Mead had fallen below 1,100 feet in elevation, a level not seen since the 1930s, when the reservoir was still filling for the first time. 3/4 of a century of stored buffer drained, and the water kept dropping. By 2021, the situation was severe enough that the Federal Bureau of Reclamation, the agency that manages the river, took an action it had never taken in the entire history of the compact. It declared an official shortage, a Tier 1 shortage, and a declared shortage is not a weather event. It is a legal event. It reaches out and removes water from real users by force of federal law. It removed that water from the states with the weakest legal positions, the states that signed last, that agreed to junior priority, that traded leverage for infrastructure money and got the short end of a deal that was already built on a flawed number. Arizona took the hardest blow. Arizona had been the last of the lower basin states to ratify the compact, holding out for decades in search of a better deal. When it finally signed, it accepted junior status in exchange for federal funding to construct the Central Arizona Project, a canal 336 miles long that hauls Colorado River water uphill across the desert to Phoenix and Tucson. The cost was approximately $4 billion, over $10 billion in today's money. It is an extraordinary feat of engineering, and under shortage conditions, it delivers water that gets shut off first. In 2021, Arizona lost roughly 512,000 acre-feet in a single federal ruling, about 18% of its Colorado River supply, gone overnight. In 2022, the cuts deepened. Meanwhile, drive west from Phoenix into the California desert and you find something that should not exist: green. Endless, geometric, irrigated green in a landscape that receives a few inches of rain per year. The Imperial Valley. 500,000 acres of farmland that grows a substantial portion of the lettuce, broccoli, and winter vegetables that appear in American grocery stores in January. Those farmers hold water rights that predate Las Vegas. They predate Phoenix. In some cases, they predate the compact itself. Their claims are senior. So when the shortage arrives and the cuts begin, the Imperial Valley farms do not feel them first. The cities do. Wrap your head around that for a moment. Cities with millions of residents, rationing, lawns dying, reservoirs marking their own decline in white mineral lines on canyon walls. And the water that could theoretically relieve the pressure is instead, entirely legally, being used to grow alfalfa in the desert. And a significant portion of that alfalfa is then loaded onto ships and exported to Saudi Arabia and China to feed livestock on the other side of the planet. Nobody is breaking a law. Water rights are property rights. Senior rights are senior rights. But if you are a resident of Phoenix watching your allocation shrink while water sails overseas as hay bales, that tension is real, and it is growing. A tunnel and the tell. Here is the moment in this story where the engineering stops being abstract and becomes personal. Because what Las Vegas did in response to the crisis tells you exactly what the people with the most information actually believe is coming. The city of Las Vegas draws its water from Lake Mead through a series of intake pipes, essentially giant straws pushed into the lake bed at specific depths. As long as the water level stays above those intakes, Las Vegas has water. When the level drops below them, the city goes dry. By the mid-2000s, it was clear that the lake was not going to stay where it had been. City engineers and water managers began doing the calculations, and what they concluded was not reassuring. The existing intakes, designed for a lake that was expected to stay relatively full, were going to be dangerously exposed if current trends continued. So Las Vegas did something extraordinary. It spent approximately $1.5 billion drilling a new intake tunnel, intake number 3, through the solid rock at the very bottom of Lake Mead, the lowest possible point. A tunnel so deep that even if the lake fell to what engineers call dead pool, the level at which water can no longer flow through Hoover Dam's penstocks at all, Las Vegas could still pull water out. Think about what that decision represents. No city spends $1.5 billion on infrastructure because it expects conditions to improve. You do not drill through bedrock to the bottom of a lake as a precaution if you believe the lake is going to refill. That tunnel is not optimism. That tunnel is a city quietly, expensively, making arrangements for a future its own public statements do not fully acknowledge. It is the engineering equivalent of building a bunker while telling your neighbors there's nothing to worry about. And the number that tunnel is built to survive, the number that keeps water managers in the Southwest awake at night, is 895 feet. That is the elevation at which Lake Mead reaches dead pool. The point at which Hoover Dam falls silent, no turbines, no power generation, no water flowing downstream at all. 40 million people across 7 states, suddenly scrambling for water that was overpromised before any of them were born. The current surface elevation of the lake sits roughly 50 to 60 feet above 895. In a bad drought year, the lake can lose 20 feet. Do the arithmetic yourself. The margin is not comfortable, but the water gives back. Now we come back to the lake bed, back to the mud, back to the things that have been waiting. As the water has pulled away from the canyon walls, it has not just exposed rock, it has exposed time. Layer by layer, the receding waterline has revealed a stratigraphy of everything the reservoir absorbed over 90 years of existence. The boats from the 1980s and 1990s are, in some ways, the most poignant. Several were found sitting completely upright, undamaged except by time, as though their owners had simply forgotten to retrieve them. Propellers intact, hull markings still legible, sitting in silt that had held them perfectly still for decades, while the world above changed beyond recognition. The infrastructure recoveries have their own weight. Old pipes, valves, construction equipment from the dam building era, remnants of a time when the project was new and the men who built it were still alive. Artifacts of the moment America made its great wager in the desert. And then there are the human remains. The barrel discovered in May 2022 was the most prominent, but authorities have been clear that it was not likely to be the last. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department opened an active homicide investigation. Clark County coroners confirmed the gunshot wound, the age of the remains, consistent with late 1970s to early 1980s deposition, places the killing squarely within the most active period of organized crime influence in Las Vegas. This is not speculation. The historical record of mob activity in Las Vegas during the 1970s is well documented in court records, in FBI files, in the testimonies of surviving participants, and in books and investigations that have been in the public domain for decades. The lake's proximity to that world and its utility as a disposal site is not a reach of imagination. What is remarkable is that the lake worked. Whatever was put down there stayed down there. Not because the perpetrators were particularly careful, or because investigators failed to look, but because the lake was simply too vast, too deep, and too full for anything on the surface to find what lay beneath. The water was the accomplice, and it was a reliable one for 50 years. Now ask yourself this. The barrel that surfaced is dated to the late 1970s. The lake began its serious decline around 2000. That means there is somewhere between 20 and 40 vertical feet of lake level drop that has already happened, and the remains found so far correspond to the upper range of that exposure. What is waiting at deeper levels? What was deposited in the 1960s, the 1950s, the period when the reservoir was first filling, and the mob's presence in Las Vegas was at its absolute height? As the water continues to fall, and the models say it will, those depths will come into range. Divers have been active in the newly exposed shallows since the exposure began. Researchers and law enforcement have both expressed interest in systematic survey work as conditions allow. Every foot the lake drops opens a new band of previously inaccessible history. And the history of the mid-20th century American Southwest is not always the kind that wants to be found. The reckoning. Here is where we land. Here is the thing the white ring on the rock is actually measuring. The Colorado River Compact of 1922 made a promise to 40 million people, a promise that the river it was built on cannot keep. The overpromise is not a rounding error. It is structural, deliberate in its convenience, and now running into the hard wall of physical reality. The buffer that hid the gap for 70 years has been drawn down past the point of comfortable recovery. Engineers in the Bureau of Reclamation's own internal documents now acknowledge that Lake Mead may never fully refill, that the models point to a warmer, drier future, a permanently thinner snowpack in the Rockies, a permanently smaller river. The compact will have to be renegotiated. The question is not whether. It is whether that happens through deliberate, painful, politically costly conversation among 7 states and the federal government, or through the brute arithmetic of a lake that simply runs out. And here is what makes that question harder than it looks. 80% of the Colorado River's water goes to agriculture, not to cities, not to the Las Vegas fountains everyone loves to point at, to agriculture. And the water rights that govern that agriculture were established a century ago, legally protected as property rights, and in many cases held by users whose political leverage is disproportionate to their population. To bring the system into balance with the actual river, the 13 million acre-foot river, not the ghost of the 5 million acre-foot fantasy, would require cutting somewhere in the range of 4 million acre-feet per year from current allocations. That is not a trim. That is surgery without anesthesia. It means farms go fallow. It means crops that Americans buy at the grocery store in January either disappear or get dramatically more expensive. It means water rights that families have held for generations get extinguished. It means cities that built themselves around guaranteed supply have to reimagine their futures in the middle of having them. There is no easy cut. Every cut falls on someone real. And this is the question I want to leave with you, because it is not abstract and it does not have a clean answer. If you had the authority to fix this, not the political will, not the diplomatic skills, not the billions of dollars, just the authority to make the call, where do you start? Do you go after the senior agricultural rights, the farmers with the oldest claims and the biggest allocations, knowing that some of those farms are growing export crops for foreign markets? Do you ration the cities more aggressively, making life harder for the millions of people who actually voted for whoever is supposed to be managing this? Do you pay farmers to fallow their fields, using public money to retire the rights that the public in 1922 never imagined would outlast the lake itself? Or do you wait and let the lake fall another 20 feet, and then another, and let the crisis make the decision for everyone, the way it always does when the humans in charge find the choices too painful to make on purpose? The white ring on the rock does not have an opinion. It is just measuring. Patient and precise and relentless, recording in mineral exactly how far the lie has fallen. It was 175 feet of white stone above the waterline at its worst measured point. It is still climbing, and under the newly exposed mud, in the expanding ring of lake bed that hasn't seen daylight in decades, something is waiting. The things that were hidden when the water was high enough to hide them. The barrel was the first. Investigators expect it will not be the last. The lake spent 90 years keeping its secrets. It is done with that now. The question is whether the people who built this system are ready to do the same.